So watercolor is considered a difficult medium. I think everybody that knows anything about it knows that. Hard, right? It's hard, right? Really hard? You ever stop to think about why? I think it's useful. I think it's helpful in knowing what to focus on. So let's talk about that. So it's interesting to me that the most difficult things about watercolor also tend to be the most beautiful things about it. The things that give it its inherent and unique beauty and qualities. I would say there's primarily two categories, and that's transparency and fluidity. So let's take a look at those. We'll break it down to individual traits and why transparency gives watercolor painters or would-be watercolor painters such difficulty. And as we look at those characteristics, we'll also look at how to think about our painting to work with those characteristics. Change our paradigm to start thinking in terms of partnering with the medium instead of working against it. Alright, so transparency. How does that affect your painting in adverse ways? Well, the first thing is nearly everything you paint is visible through the layers that you paint on top of that. So you have very little to no covering ability unless you're using something like gouache. So pencil, previous strokes, the way the strokes look, anything that's dried with a hard edge, everything is visible through the layers to come, unless those layers are extremely dark. So it's the first trait, I think, of watercolor that gives it its unforgiving quality. So how do you deal with that? What do you think about? Well, obviously planning. One myth, though, that I want to dispel is that you have to be a painter that can lay down the perfect stroke the first time. A master watercolorist is someone who goes in, gets just the right value on their brush, puts it down, gets that stroke just right the first time, and whoom, magic. Now, I won't lie to you, there are a few watercolorists that can do that. That's not the norm, I assure you. Don't think to be a great watercolorist, you got to go in and be able to lay down that perfect stroke just right the first time. If you're a beginner, you're just learning, here's how I think you should look at the transparency factor and the fact that all layers can be seen through all other layers. Build those layers gradually. Build them lightly and softly. Make sure you learn how to blend. Go from light to dark. Learn how to glaze. Use great paper, because glazing doesn't work on cheap paper, not very well anyway. And learn how to build those tones gradually. So what else? Well, transparency means that your colors are just going to get darker. Each layer that you put down is going to get darker and darker and darker. Now, for you advanced painters, I know that's obvious, but beginners still don't think about that when they paint. They think that they can add more color, they can add a different color, they can add more layers, they can cover up what they've done and not change the value very much. But every layer you add lowers the value more and more and more until you end up with something very, very dark or very, very heavy. So again, how do we think about this? Again, planning. Think about it in advance. Number two, you go from light to dark. You start by painting light layers, let them dry, paint glazes over the top of that. You know, once you start thinking about these things, and you just can't fight them. And a lot of people think, you know, oh, I can't paint the way I want to paint. Well, that's right. You can't paint the way you want to paint. You've got to paint the way watercolor lets you paint, the way watercolor shines, in a way that facilitates the way watercolor is. In addition to the planning and just thinking about light to dark layers, practice on scrap, render shapes, render swatches, glaze over them, see what happens, try shading simple objects. You can actually go in and create your own exercises. PB&J, afternoon snack of champions. You never outgrow these. Okay, so transparency has Okay, so transparency affects it in another way. For the most part, you don't use white. You protect the white of the paper or you paint around it. This is something you must always be thinking about as you're planning your painting, as you're doing your painting. Consider the other things that we just talked about. When you add a wash to something, it gets darker. That includes highlight areas. There are a few things you can do to recover those, but by and large, you want to do as little correcting and lifting as possible. It affects the freshness and the surface of the paper. So any layers over a highlight usually will just make it darker. I have a little tenet that I follow when I'm planning my highlights and leaving my highlights, and that is, if in doubt, leave it out. It's either going to be white or something very bright, and the only thing left to do is determine the value of that highlight. So if in doubt, leave it out. Leave those areas that you're not sure about white until you're ready to go in and add value, and then do it gradually. Protect the highlights, protect the whites. That means painting around them or using mask. So what else? Okay, permanency presents a couple of problems. Now you may be thinking, now hold on Steve, this is a water-soluble medium and it's not permanent like acrylic. Correct, but the fact is that when you put watercolor down in paper, and the fact that you are using an absorbent paper, it's all, for all practical purposes, is permanent. I mean, you can do some lifting, and it depends on the paper and how much lifting quality there is in your paper, but you're never going to get that completely off the surface. And because of the transparency issue, you'll just have a mess if you try to get it all off. Now, correcting in certain spots, of course, is fine. So the permanence factor just means that the paint stains, it's going to be difficult to correct and to lift. But just like with all the other characteristics, it's one of those things that you know going in and you plan for. Forewarned is forearmed. Lastly, fluidity presents some problems. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's one of the most exciting things, one of the most beautiful things about watercolor, but it's also one of the most unique things. Just remember that wet in wet, or wet watercolor and wet paper, interacts more lively than dry paper. And the wetter your paper is, the more interactive, I guess you would say, the more lively that action is. And the more it seems to kind of take off and do things on its own. What's the best way to deal with that? Well, get to know the stages. There are 5 stages, and you should understand how the watercolor works in each of those 5. There's what I call puddle wet. Puddle wet is just how it sounds. It's this big standing water on top of your paper that moves around. It looks like a little puddle. Very wet, very glossy. Generally you don't paint that way, but there are certain situations and certain types of painting where you might want to get some real flowy effects. There's what I would call glossy. That's just under puddle wet. No longer do you have standing water, but the sheen left by the water is very glossy, high shine. Then there is a sheen with semi-gloss sheen. It's starting to get a little less shiny, but it's still very wet. Then I would have what most people call the danger zone, and that's matte damp. Matte damp is there's no sheen whatsoever, but the paper's still very damp. That's where you get your back runs. That's usually the area in which you want to just leave it alone and let it dry. And then you have completely dry paper. Completely dry paper and paint is usually the state that you want before you start adding glazes and other washes on top. Just play with those stages. You get different amounts of movement in each, and you get different amounts of saturation in each. Experiment, experiment, experiment. Watercolor has a reputation for being difficult, and that's what we're addressing. Best way to excel at watercolor is just to face it head on and learn these traits, learn what it is, why it is that these things are difficult, and just change your paradigm and thinking. Go into it knowing what happens and knowing what you're going to do about it to defeat it. Watercolor is not a medium that you can force. So I hope that helps a little, hope that helps just your thinking. Have fun with it, and we'll see you in the next video.